Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Ozarks. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the late summer of 1893, the Ozark Hills lay heavy with heat. Cicadas filled the air, and the pastures around the river bottoms baked hard under a sun that offered no relief. According to county plats from the time, the land in question sat at the edge of cultivation, too rough for orderly farming, yet controlled by a single estate whose boundaries were enforced more by reputation than by fencing. The owner of that land was Elias Harrow, listed in tax ledgers as a stockman and cotton planter. He was not born into wealth but had accumulated acreage steadily after the war, acquiring parcels others abandoned. His operation was modest by plantation standards, but large enough to employ several hands and maintain breeding stock, among them 5 bulls known locally for their volatility. Harrow's name appears often in records of the period, though never prominently. He donated to the church irregularly, paid his taxes late, and avoided civic office. Neighbors described him as measured and unfond of correction. One affidavit later summarized his temperament succinctly: he preferred outcomes to arguments. The man at the center of the incident is harder to trace. In payroll books he appears only as Jonah Reed, paid in coin, not credit, and dismissed from the rolls abruptly in August of that year. Reed was in his early 30s, a laborer without local family ties. He had worked cattle before. Nothing in the record suggests he was reckless or defiant. The event itself was first noted not as a crime, but as a disturbance. On an afternoon when the heat had driven most workers into shade, several witnesses heard shouting from the lower pasture, a fenced enclosure used to isolate aggressive stock. What followed was brief, chaotic, and poorly recorded. According to later testimony, Harrow ordered Reed into the pen under the pretense of retrieving a tool. The gate was closed behind him. 5 bulls, recently agitated and separated for breeding, were already inside. What happened next varied depending on who spoke. Some claimed Reed froze. Others said he moved slowly, deliberately avoiding sudden motion. What all accounts agree on is this: the bulls did not immediately charge. A neighbor watching from the fence line later told a deputy it was like they were waiting to be told. No such instruction came. The pen was opened less than 10 minutes later. Reed emerged alive. He was injured, shaken, and unable to explain precisely how he avoided being gored. There were marks on the ground, deep impressions where hooves had struck, but no blood. A physician who examined Reed that evening noted bruising consistent with impact, but no puncture wounds. The witnesses were, by their own admission, shocked, not because Reed survived, but because, in their words, he should not have. The incident was not reported formally until weeks later, after Reed left the county entirely. By then, stories had begun to circulate, shaped by older fears and recent memories. Some recalled the region's earlier vigilante history, when men like the Bald Knobbers enforced private justice through spectacle and intimidation. Others insisted this was different, smaller, quieter, and more personal. What remained, even in the earliest accounts, was the sense that the act had not been impulsive. It had been arranged. And the Ozarks, accustomed to holding onto such arrangements without comment, did not rush to explain what had been witnessed that day. The absence of an immediate complaint shaped everything that followed. County records show no entry regarding the incident until late September, when a traveling constable noted rumors of unsafe stock handling on Harrow's land. By then, Jonah Reed was already gone, having left no forwarding address and collected no final wages beyond what was owed in cash. Witnesses were reluctant. Several had worked for Harrow seasonally. Others depended on access to his grazing land. When questioned later, they framed their statements carefully, emphasizing uncertainty. "I didn't see the gate close," one said. "I heard it," said another. The distinction mattered. Harrow himself offered a brief explanation when approached. He stated that Reed had entered the pen against instruction and that the gate must have swung. He described the bulls as temperamental but manageable. No disciplinary action was recorded. No charges were filed. Yet contradictions accumulated quietly. A farmhand named Caleb Morrow submitted a sworn statement months later after leaving the county. He claimed Harrow had ordered Reed into the enclosure to teach him steadiness. Morrow wrote that Harrow believed fear revealed a man's usefulness. "He said cattle know when a man's heart jumps," Morrow recalled. Medical notes from Dr. Silas Breen, who treated Reed, complicate the account further. Breen documented bruising along Reed's ribs and thighs, consistent with being crowded and struck by mass rather than horn. He also noted an elevated pulse that persisted unusually long after the event. In the margin, Breen added a line, "Survival likely owed to stillness." Reed did not linger. Within days, he sold personal effects and departed south. A clerk recorded that Reed refused to give testimony when asked later, stating only that he had seen enough of the place. That phrase appears twice in the ledger underlined. As weeks passed, the story spread beyond the immediate witnesses. It was retold at feed stores and church steps, losing specifics and gaining implication. Some versions claimed Harrow had done this before. Others insisted the bulls had been trained. No evidence supported either claim. What did surface were older grievances, property disputes, accusations of intimidation. None reached court. In the Ozarks, matters often settled before they were named. The first formal investigation began after a separate incident. A bull found dead near the same enclosure, its injuries inconsistent with disease. Harrow attributed the loss to heat and agitation. A deputy noted the timing and moved on. References to earlier regional violence crept into private conversation. The bald knobbers were mentioned not as perpetrators but as precedent, proof that the hills had once accepted demonstrations meant to warn rather than punish. The comparison unsettled some, reassured others. By winter, the pasture pen was reinforced. The bulls were sold off individually. Harrow reduced his operation. On paper, the matter closed, but the story did not. Because what lingered was not the cruelty alleged, but the calculation implied. The sense that a man had been placed into danger not to kill him, but to measure something unseen. And in the Ozarks, measurements made quietly were often the ones remembered longest. By the time winter settled over the hills, the incident had hardened into something less like rumor and more like reference. People spoke of it obliquely, as if naming it too directly might give it shape again. In store ledgers and church minutes, Elias Harrow's name appeared unchanged. Yet in conversation it carried a pause. The county sheriff, Thomas I. Kell, finally opened a quiet inquiry in January, prompted not by Reed's disappearance but by a pattern of departures. 2 other laborers left Harrow's employ that season without collecting final pay. When asked why, one man replied, "I didn't want to be tested." Kell noted the phrasing and asked no follow-up. Kell's notes, preserved among his papers, suggest uncertainty rather than urgency. He wrote that no statute addressed placing a man in peril without injury, and that intent would be difficult to prove absent testimony from the injured party. Reed's refusal to speak effectively stalled the matter. Still, Kell interviewed neighbors. One, Mrs. Lorna Pettigrew, recalled seeing Harrow watch the enclosure that afternoon without intervening. "He didn't look angry," she said. "He looked curious." Another witness described Harrow opening the gate himself slowly after Reed emerged. These details conflicted with Harrow's claim of accident, but none were decisive. Attention turned to the land itself. The pasture pen sat on ground long associated with isolation, once used to separate unruly stock, earlier to confine trespassing animals. A survey map from the 1870s shows the same enclosure outlined faintly, suggesting continuity of use. The place had a function before Harrow acquired it. In his journal, a visiting minister recorded a conversation with Reed weeks after the incident, encountered by chance at a river crossing. Reed reportedly said little. When asked how he survived, he answered, "I didn't give them anything to answer." The minister admitted he did not understand the remark but felt it mattered. By early spring, the bulls were gone. Harrow claimed financial necessity, yet several buyers later stated they were offered at reduced price with unusual urgency. One remarked that Harrow insisted the animals be separated permanently. No explanation was given. The investigation produced no charges. The file was marked inactive, not closed. Sheriff Kell added a final line, "No further action advised unless pattern repeats." It was an acknowledgement that something had occurred without leaving a legal footprint. What followed instead was avoidance. Fewer men sought work on Harrow's land. Those who did stayed briefly. The pasture pen remained unused, its gate hanging open through rain and snow. References to older regional practices surfaced again. Men reminded one another how order had once been enforced through demonstration rather than decree. The name Bald Knobbers appeared in letters and side conversations, not as accusation but as context. The Ozarks had long understood the power of being seen to do something without explanation. By summer, Jonah Reed was reported in Arkansas, working rail lines under a different name. When asked about Ozark stock work, he declined. "I don't stand where things are measured," he reportedly said. Elias Harrow continued on his land, quieter, less visible. No further incidents were recorded, yet the pasture pen remained. And those who passed it noticed how, even empty, it commanded attention, how the ground inside stayed hard-packed long after rains, as though something there had been held in place deliberately. In the months that followed, the land itself became the most consistent witness. While statements stalled and memories softened, the pasture pen remained unchanged, its posts weathered, its latch rusting in the open position. No stock was returned to it. Harrow gave instructions that the enclosure was to be avoided, citing structural concerns. No repairs were ordered. County tax records from 1894 show a slight decline in Harrow's declared assets. Portions of his land were leased rather than worked. His presence in town diminished. When he did appear, he kept conversations brief. One merchant later recalled that Harrow stopped asking questions altogether. Like he already knew what he needed, the man said. A second incident, less dramatic but more troubling, occurred that spring. A drifter passing through the county reported being warned off Harrow's land by one of the owner's foremen. The warning, according to the drifter, included a gesture toward the empty pen. No threat was spoken. None was required. The drifter left the area the same day. Sheriff Kell received the account and added it to the dormant file. In the margin, he wrote, "Deterrence without act." It was the same language he had encountered while studying older cases of regional intimidation, episodes where the goal had not been harm, but compliance. The parallel to earlier vigilante practices surfaced again, including those attributed to the bald knobbers years before. Kell did not draw a direct line, but he recognized the method. Around this time, a traveling agricultural inspector visited the area and requested to examine Harrow's facilities. His report makes brief mention of the pen, describing it as adequate for containment but unsuitable for prolonged exposure of agitated stock. The wording suggested risk. The report was filed and forgotten. Jonah Reed's absence continued to complicate matters. Without his testimony, the incident lacked a center. Letters sent to possible addresses went unanswered. A clerk noted that Reed appeared deliberately untraceable. His silence did more to close the case than any ruling could have. Yet among those who remained, memory sharpened rather than faded. Laborers spoke quietly of tests and proofs, terms that had no formal meaning but carried weight. Men avoided isolated work. Tasks were shared more often. The incident had altered behavior without altering law. By late summer, Harrow's operation had shifted focus. Cattle were replaced with less volatile stock. The pasture pen was left to weeds. In a letter to a distant associate, Harrow wrote that he was done with experiments. The letter offered no context. No further violence occurred. No repetition followed. On paper, the episode ended without consequence. But the Ozarks were not inclined to forget demonstrations, especially those that relied on restraint rather than spectacle. The power of the incident lay not in what had happened, but in what could have. And as the seasons turned, the empty pen remained a landmark of that understanding, a place where nothing occurred, yet everyone knew why. By the end of that year, the case existed in fragments rather than facts. The sheriff's file held statements that contradicted one another without canceling out. No single account could be elevated above the rest. Instead, they formed a perimeter around an event no one wished to name too directly. What drew renewed attention was not the pen, but Harrow's past. A clerk reviewing older deeds noted that Harrow had acquired several parcels under strained circumstances, land forfeited after disputes, sales completed quickly, neighbors relocating soon after. None of these actions were illegal. Taken together, they suggested a man who preferred resolution without negotiation. An elderly neighbor, Amos Wilkes, later gave testimony that Harrow had once remarked, Men behave better when they know what could happen. Wilkes could not recall the context. He remembered only the tone, matter of fact, not angry. The statement was recorded and set aside. The pasture pen drew occasional visitors despite its abandonment. Boys dared one another to enter it. Livestock avoided it instinctively. A surveyor noted that grass grew thinner inside the enclosure than outside, though no stock had grazed there for months. The ground remained compacted, resistant to rain. In early 1895, a fire destroyed part of Harrow's records shed. Most papers were damaged beyond recovery. The cause was listed as accidental, lantern left burning. Among the lost items were payroll books and correspondence from the previous 2 years. No investigation followed. Loss of records was common in the hills. Around the same time, reports surfaced that Harrow intended to sell the property. He denied this publicly, but correspondence suggests negotiations had begun quietly. Buyers hesitated. The land carried a reputation now, subtle but persistent. Jonah Reed was spotted once more that spring, this time in Indian Territory, working freight lines. A former Ozark laborer recognized him and attempted conversation. Reed declined. When asked about Harrow, he replied only, "I was measured and found unnecessary." The phrase was relayed second-hand and never verified. No legal action followed. The sheriff retired later that year, leaving the file to his successor with a brief note. Incident produced compliance, not crime. It was unclear whether this was observation or judgment. As time passed, the incident ceased to be discussed as an event and became instead a reference. When men spoke of standing their ground, they invoked it. When they warned others away from unnecessary risks, they gestured toward the memory of the pen. It required no detail to be effective. Elias Harrow remained on his land older, quieter, his operation diminished. He attended church sporadically. He spoke little. Those who encountered him later described a man satisfied not by outcomes, but by the knowledge that outcomes were possible. And the Ozarks, which had long recognized such calculations, absorbed the lesson without commentary, leaving behind an empty enclosure, a silent file, and the understanding that sometimes restraint could be as instructive as violence. By the spring of 1896, the incident had begun to settle into the background of county life, yet it remained present in smaller, harder-to-measure ways. Work patterns shifted. Men preferred tasks that kept them visible to one another. Isolation, once accepted as part of rural labor, became something negotiated rather than assumed. The new sheriff, Edwin R. Holt, reviewed the inactive file shortly after taking office. His marginal notes suggest frustration. He underlined the absence of statute again and again. "No injury sustained," he wrote, then added beneath it, "yet injury intended." The question had no legal answer. Holt interviewed Elias Harrow once formally in June. The transcript is brief. Harrow denied malice, denied intent, denied even understanding how the situation had escalated. He insisted Reed had acted against instruction. When Holt asked why the gate had been closed, Harrow replied that he did not recall closing it. The answer was neither defensive nor apologetic. It was simply complete. Around this time, comparisons to older regional practices resurfaced more openly. In a letter to a colleague, Holt referenced how communities once maintained order through display rather than punishment, citing the legacy of groups like the Bald Knobbers without naming any connection. "The hills remember methods," Holt wrote. "They do not require repetition." The letter was never sent. The pasture pen itself continued to exert a quiet influence. No one repaired it. No one dismantled it. It stood as a suggestion rather than a warning. Children stopped daring one another to enter. Travelers avoided stopping nearby. Even animals skirted it, choosing longer routes around the enclosure. A local physician, Dr. Marion Cole, examined a farmhand who claimed to have suffered panic attacks after briefly entering the pen alone. Cole noted no physical injury, but wrote that the man's symptoms were consistent with prolonged apprehension without event. The phrase captured what many felt but could not articulate. In late summer, Harrow sold off another portion of his land. The buyer later stated that the transaction was hurried, though no reason was given. Harrow's remaining holdings shrank to a manageable size. His operation became inward-facing, private. He employed fewer men and relied more on family. Jonah Reed did not return. His absence hardened into a boundary of its own. Without his voice, the incident lacked a narrative center. The silence served Harrow as effectively as any defense. By the end of the year, the sheriff's office stopped referencing the file altogether. It was neither solved nor unsolved. It had simply run out of avenues. What endured instead was a shift in how authority was understood. Harrow's reputation did not grow violent. It grew final. People complied without confrontation. They chose other employers. They altered paths. The lesson had been delivered once. And in the Ozarks, where memory often outlasted record, that was enough. The pasture pen remained empty through winter, its posts creaking in the wind, its gates swinging freely. No sign marked it. No law addressed it. Yet everyone knew where it was. And everyone understood why they did not linger there, even years later when nothing had happened, and nothing ever did again. As 1897 unfolded, the matter lingered in an odd administrative afterlife. It was no longer discussed as a potential crime, yet it had not been dismissed as rumor. Instead, it surfaced in indirect ways, references in correspondence, pauses in testimony, habits that required no explanation. A county assessor noted that Harrow's land valuation stabilized after years of fluctuation. The change was attributed to reduced output, but a private note added that labor turnover has ceased by avoidance. It was a clinical observation. Fewer workers came, fewer left. The land no longer needed managing at scale. That year, a circuit judge traveling through the district requested briefings on unusual disputes resolved without docket. The sheriff's office provided summaries, including a single paragraph about the pen incident, stripped of names, dates softened, the focus placed on the absence of injury. The judge read it and returned the page without comment. Later, he wrote to a colleague that the hills had their own instruments of order. He did not specify which. Folklore began to settle around the enclosure, though it resisted embellishment. There were no claims of hauntings, no exaggerated retellings. The story remained stubbornly practical. Men said only that it was where Harrow proved a point. No one asked what the point was. A schoolteacher recorded a child's remark after a lesson on farm safety. "My father says don't go where men were tried." The teacher corrected the phrasing and moved on. The child did not. Midway through the year, Harrow's health declined. He traveled briefly to Springfield to consult a physician, returning thinner and more reserved. He ceased attending livestock auctions. Visitors were received rarely. When he did speak, those present remarked that he spoke of balance between risk and outcome, effort and result. The pasture pen finally began to fail structurally. One post collapsed after heavy rain and the gate sagged permanently. No repair followed. The enclosure's usefulness had ended, and its message required no reinforcement. A former laborer passing through the county years later was asked whether he feared Harrow. He answered, "No, I feared what he thought was reasonable." The distinction mattered. By autumn, the incident had become a reference point rather than a story. When disagreements arose, men asked whether they were worth testing. The question ended arguments efficiently. No one wished to be measured. The Ozarks had seen such economies of force before, during earlier periods when restraint had proven more durable than punishment. The memory of those times, including the quiet legacy of the bald knobbers, hovered without being invoked. The hills recognized the pattern. As winter approached, snow dusted the empty pen. Hoofprints appeared nearby, deer, not cattle, then veered away. The ground inside remained undisturbed. Nothing else occurred. And that absence, sustained, intentional, was understood by those who remained as the final outcome of the incident. Not injury, not trial, but a lasting adjustment in how power was demonstrated and respected. By 1898, the incident had passed fully into what clerks referred to as institutional memory, known, but no longer actively consulted. The pasture pen no longer functioned as a structure, yet its presence remained fixed in conversation. Directions were still given in relation to it. Boundaries were described by its location. It had become a point of orientation rather than enclosure. That spring, a small inquiry arose from an unexpected source. A state agricultural inspector reviewing animal containment practices noted Harrow's former pen in passing and remarked that its design prioritized control over safety. The inspector recommended alterations if it were ever to be used again. The report was acknowledged. No changes were made. The pen was never used again. Harrow's operations continued to contract. His remaining cattle were docile breeds. Labor needs were minimal. The man who once relied on force of example now appeared content with quiet isolation. Neighbors remarked that he had grown reflective. Whether this reflected age or satisfaction was unclear. Jonah Reed's name surfaced once more that year in a freight ledger from Little Rock, listed under a different surname. A clerk familiar with the Ozark file recognized the handwriting style on a signature and flagged it privately. When asked later why no follow-up occurred, the clerk answered simply, "There was nothing to recover." Stories about the bulls themselves shifted subtly. Some claimed they had been specially selected. Others insisted they were ordinary animals agitated by heat and confinement. No purchase record supported either claim. What mattered was not the animals, but the condition created around them. A visiting historian researching post-war rural authority structures passed through the area that summer. In his notes, he wrote that Harrow represented a type common to isolated regions, men who exercised influence not through repeated action, but through a single decisive demonstration. He compared this to earlier Ozark figures who had enforced order quietly, including those associated historically with the bald knobbers. The comparison was analytical, not accusatory. As autumn arrived, the remains of the pen deteriorated further. Fence rails were repurposed by neighbors. Only the outline remained visible in the soil, a rectangular impression where grass refused to grow evenly. Livestock continued to avoid the space. By year's end, the incident had become something close to settled. Not resolved but contained. No one sought to reopen it. No one benefited from doing so. The Ozarks had absorbed the lesson. Authority did not need repetition. Fear did not need spectacle. A single controlled moment, carefully placed, could shape behavior longer than any decree. And the land, long accustomed to such economies of force, held the outline of the pen like a memory pressed into clay, faint, persistent, and resistant to being smoothed away. By 1899, the incident had begun to migrate from living memory into record shorthand. County documents referenced it obliquely. The enclosure matter, the stock pen episode, phrases that assumed familiarity without supplying detail. The compression itself was revealing. What had once unsettled now required fewer words. Sheriff Holt, nearing the end of his term, requested a final review of dormant files. His notes indicate he revisited the pen incident not to reopen it, but to understand its persistence. He wrote that no comparable event had occurred since, yet labor disputes resolved more quickly on Harrow's land than elsewhere. Compliance precedes instruction, Holt observed. The line reads less like policing and more like anthropology. That summer, a new family leased a neighboring parcel and asked permission to dismantle the remaining posts for firewood. Harrow declined, offering no reason. The posts remained until winter storms finally took them down. Even then, the ground outline endured, a rectangle where grass grew thin and uneven, as though compacted by memory rather than use. A traveling physician, Dr. Elbridge Moore, recorded a curious pattern while treating farmhands across the district. Men spoke of anxiety localized to place rather than event, unease near certain landmarks without recalling why. Moore did not connect this to the pen explicitly, but his case notes include a margin remark, anticipatory fear without narrative. The phrase circulated quietly among professionals. Jonah Reed's trail faded further. A freight clerk in Memphis reported a man resembling Reed declining work that involved livestock handling. When asked why, the man replied, "I don't step where outcomes are rehearsed." The clerk did not know the meaning. Those who did recognized the cadence. References to the region's older methods of order surfaced again in private correspondence. A county judge wrote to a colleague that the Hills had always preferred demonstration to decree, citing the legacy of earlier vigilante periods again, the bald knobbers appearing as historical context rather than comparison. The judge concluded that modern law struggled where memory enforced itself. Harrow's health continued to wane. He delegated most decisions to relatives and reduced travel. Those who visited him remarked on his calm. He spoke rarely of the past. When asked about the pen, he said only, "It served its purpose." No one pressed him to define the purpose. By year's end, the enclosure's outline was partially obscured by leaf fall. Children no longer played near it. travelers stopped using it as a landmark. And yet when directions were given, people still referenced it, just past where the ground won't take grass. Nothing new occurred, and that in the Ozarks was understood as confirmation that the demonstration had succeeded, not by repeating itself, but by making repetition unnecessary. The turn of the century brought little change to the outline left behind. In 1900, county offices reorganized their archives, condensing older matters into summary cards meant to save space. The Penn incident received one such card, date approximate, names abbreviated, outcome listed as no injury sustained. The compression reduced the event to a technicality, but it did not diminish its influence. Elias Harrow withdrew further from public view. Church attendance became irregular. His correspondence narrowed to family and a single livestock broker who handled the final dispersal of his remaining stock. When asked why he no longer kept bulls, Harrow reportedly said, "They invite answers I don't need anymore." The remark was relayed second-hand and never confirmed. A small, telling development occurred that spring. A neighboring landowner petitioned to reroute a fence line to avoid the low ground where the pen had stood. He cited drainage issues. The request was approved quickly. No one objected. The land adjusted itself around the absence. Sheriff Holt retired that summer. In his exit notes, he listed unresolved cases that might warrant future attention. The Penn incident was not among them. Instead, Holt wrote a general observation. Certain acts conclude themselves. The line appears nowhere else in the file. Outside the county, interest flickered briefly. A regional newspaper ran a piece on rural labor disputes resolved without courts. Though no names were printed, the description was close enough that locals recognized the reference. The article framed the practice as archaic and fading. Letters to the editor disagreed quietly, suggesting such methods persisted where law traveled slowly. Jonah Reed's name did not appear again in any record tied to the Ozarks. A freight company ledger from St. Louis lists a Jonah R. with similar age and handwriting, but the trail goes cold thereafter. Whether Reed chose anonymity or found it imposed upon him remains unclear. The outline in the soil softened with rain and frost, but it did not disappear. Even after the last post collapsed, the ground retained its compacted shape. Grass grew reluctantly. Animals stepped around it. The absence behaved like a boundary. A schoolboy asked his grandfather why the spot was avoided. The grandfather answered because it already did its work. No further explanation followed. By the end of the year, the incident had ceased to be recounted as a story. It existed instead as a rule, unwritten, unchallenged. Men did not test one another. Employers did not need to threaten. The demonstration had removed the need for both. And in the Ozarks, where lessons often traveled faster than law, that was considered a complete resolution. One achieved not through judgment or punishment, but through a single, carefully measured moment that never asked to be repeated. By 1901, the incident's aftereffects had become routine rather than remarkable. New clerks entering county service learned of it only indirectly, through the shorthand elders used when discussing land boundaries or labor arrangements. The phrase "near the old enclosure" was enough to convey context. No one asked which enclosure. Elias Harrow's name appeared less frequently in records. Deeds were consolidated. Leases shortened. His estate no longer expanded. it settled. Those who dealt with him described transactions that ended quickly, without negotiation. One attorney later remarked that Harrow conducted business as though outcomes were already agreed upon. A visiting agricultural lecturer passed through the region that autumn, speaking on modern stock handling. In a margin note preserved from his itinerary, he wrote that certain Ozark practices emphasize psychological control over physical restraint. The note offers no example. Those who read it did not need one. Around this time, the sheriff's office received an unsigned letter describing the pen incident as a necessary demonstration. The letter did not threaten, confess, or accuse. It offered no new facts. It merely stated that the outcome had prevented worse measures. The letter was filed and never answered. Jonah Reed's silence continued to shape the case more than any testimony could have. Without his voice, the incident resisted narrative closure. A minister wrote privately that Reed's refusal to speak suggested not fear but refusal, an unwillingness to lend meaning to what had been done. The distinction mattered. In the pasture where the pen had stood, the soil began to erode unevenly. Rain carved shallow channels around the compacted rectangle, leaving it slightly raised like a platform. Children noticed it first. Adults noticed it last. No one leveled it. A physician treating seasonal workers observed that men avoided resting near the spot, choosing less shaded ground instead. When asked why, they replied that the place held heat. The explanation was practical enough to end the conversation. References to earlier Ozark vigilance surfaced again in academic writing, quiet nods to a past when authority had been enforced through example rather than statute. The bald knobbers were mentioned as historical context, not parallel. The suggestion was that such methods had not vanished. They had simply refined themselves. By winter, Harrow's health had declined further. He traveled rarely and received fewer visitors. When a relative asked whether he regretted the incident, Harrow reportedly answered, "Regret implies excess." The remark, relayed by a third party, was never challenged. The county file remained unchanged. No new events echoed the pen. No one attempted to replicate it. Its effectiveness lay precisely in that restraint. The lesson had been delivered once cleanly, and the Ozarks had accepted it without ceremony. As snow fell and erased smaller traces, the raised outline remained, subtle, persistent, and resistant to smoothing. It marked a place where nothing ultimately happened, and yet everything had changed. By 1902, the incident had reached a peculiar stability. It neither faded nor expanded. It simply remained, anchored in behavior rather than memory. Those who arrived in the county after the event learned its implications without ever hearing its details. This transfer of understanding occurred quietly, through omission and habit. A county school inspector noted in his annual report that children from farms near Harrow's land exhibited an unusual sensitivity to authority. The observation was framed as discipline and did not invite concern. Privately, the inspector wrote that the children understood consequence without instruction. The note was never forwarded. That summer, Elias Harrow's eldest nephew assumed partial control of the remaining operation. His approach differed, less severe, more procedural. Yet he inherited the benefit of the earlier demonstration without having participated in it. Workers complied readily. disputes dissolved quickly. The absence of confrontation was treated as evidence of good management. The raised outline where the pen had stood persisted despite efforts by weather to erase it. Heavy rains flattened surrounding ground, but the compacted rectangle resisted erosion. A surveyor remarked that the soil density there suggested repeated pressure without rotation. The phrase appeared in his notebook, then nowhere else. A small but telling exchange was recorded by a traveling folklorist collecting sayings unique to the Ozarks. When asked about places to avoid, one farmer replied, "Don't rest where a decision was made." The folklorist pressed for clarification. None was given. The sheriff's office received its last inquiry about the matter that year from a law student researching coercion without injury. The request was denied on the grounds that no charge had ever been filed. In his notes, the clerk wrote, "There is nothing here that can be studied without participating." The line was later struck through. Jonah Reed remained absent from all records connected to the region. His decision not to return, not to speak, and not to accuse became the final act of the incident. Without narrative, the event could not evolve into legend. It remained fixed, static, instructional. In correspondence between two ministers, one remarked that the hills had always favored single acts with long shadows. He suggested that repetition diluted meaning. The observation echoed older understandings of authority in isolated places, where restraint proved more enduring than enforcement. By autumn, even Harrow's relatives avoided discussing the matter. It no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the land's memory. The enclosure's absence had become more significant than its presence ever was. No trial occurred. No reckoning followed, yet compliance endured. And in the Ozarks, where outcomes often mattered more than process, the incident achieved what few acts ever did. It concluded itself. The ground held, the people adjusted, and nothing further was required. By 1903, the incident had crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer something that could be revisited, only something that could be circled. Officials avoided it not out of fear, but out of a shared sense that inquiry would add nothing useful. The file existed, but it had stopped behaving like a case. Elias Harrow died that spring. The death certificate listed heart failure, age 62. There was no inquest, no unusual provisions in the will. His remaining land passed quietly to family members, divided without dispute. At the funeral, attendance was modest. Those present described the service as orderly, efficient, and brief. No one spoke of the pasture pen. What followed was more telling than any public reaction. Within weeks, laborers returned to work on Harrow's former land without hesitation. The man was gone. The lesson remained. Authority had transferred without effort, carried forward by memory rather than force. A local newspaper printed a short obituary noting Harrow's years of stock work and landholding. It mentioned neither controversy nor conflict. The omission was deliberate. Editors later explained privately that the man's work was already done. That summer, a flood altered the lower pasture. Water spread over the old enclosure site, flattening the raised rectangle for the first time in years. When the water receded, the outline had softened but not disappeared. The ground retained its density. Grass returned unevenly. A surveyor updating maps marked the area as compacted soil cause undetermined. The note was accurate and insufficient. References to the incident became even rarer. Without Harrow, there was no figure to attach meaning to. The act detached itself from the actor and settled fully into place. The Ozarks had long understood such transitions, how authority could outlast the one who exercised it. Jonah Reed was mentioned one final time in a letter from Oklahoma Territory, where a man of similar description declined employment involving livestock. The letter ended with a sentence underlined twice: "I won't stand where men are proven." No follow-up occurred. By winter, the land had resumed its ordinary cycles. Snow covered the pasture evenly. Tracks crossed the former enclosure without hesitation, animals, not people. No one lingered there long enough to test whether anything remained. The incident had lost its edges. What survived was not fear, not anger, but calibration, the careful adjustment of behavior to avoid unnecessary demonstration. And so the Ozarks absorbed the event completely. It became neither warning nor legend, but something quieter, an understanding that power, once displayed without excess, did not need reinforcement. The ground remembered. The people complied. And the case, never formally closed, no longer required attention. After Harrow's death, the land entered a period of quiet redistribution. His heirs made no effort to revive the old operations. Stock numbers stayed low. Labor was seasonal and shared. Nothing resembling the former order returned, and no one seemed interested in testing whether it could. What persisted instead was an absence of conflict that outsiders found unusual. County mediators noted fewer disputes in the surrounding area than elsewhere. When disagreements arose, they resolved quickly, often without formal complaint. One clerk remarked that people there skipped the part where things escalate. It was not said with approval or concern, only observation. The pasture where the enclosure had stood changed hands twice in 3 years. Each new owner was informed vaguely that the soil there was troublesome. No one attempted to build on it. One farmer planted corn and found the stalks stunted within the old rectangle. He plowed deeper the following season, then stopped altogether. The ground resisted improvement without offering explanation. A professor from Fayetteville visited the county in 1906, studying how authority functioned in rural communities after Reconstruction. In a private letter, he described a case in the Ozarks where a single non-lethal act reshaped labor relations for a generation. He did not name Harrow, but the reference was clear. He compared the effect to earlier regional practices, again noting how groups like the Bald Knobbers had once relied on demonstration rather than enforcement, leaving memory to do the work afterward. The professor never published the passage. Around this time, a fire destroyed several older court files during routine storage clearing. Among the losses were ancillary notes related to the Penn incident, copies, correspondence, drafts. The main file survived, but it grew thinner. The loss went unremarked. Jonah Reed's name faded completely. No further sightings were reported. Whether he lived out his days quietly or continued moving was never established. His refusal to anchor the story with testimony ensured it would remain incomplete. By the end of the decade, the incident existed only as a contour in local behavior. Men avoided proving points physically. Employers relied on implication rather than threat. Disputes settled before they reached language sharp enough to record. The Ozarks had always favored such economies, doing less to achieve more. The hills had long memories and little patience for repetition. The pasture, now unremarkable to the uninitiated, still altered how people moved through it. Paths curved slightly away. Rest stops were chosen elsewhere. Even those who did not know why felt no urge to challenge the instinct. Nothing further happened there. And that in itself became the clearest evidence of the incident's enduring effect, that a single moment, carefully arranged and never repeated, had proven sufficient. By 1908, the incident had become almost entirely procedural, handled not by law but by habit. New families moved into the area and learned quickly which fields were productive, which gullies flooded, and which stretches of ground were best left alone. The former enclosure site fell into the last category without ever being named. County improvement proposals from that year show a planned access road sketched near the pasture, then rerouted in a later draft. The revision cites soil irregularities. An engineer added a private note that the ground compacted unevenly under load. No test was ordered. The road went elsewhere. A physician compiling notes on occupational stress among farmhands recorded an odd pattern. Workers reported unease tied to locations rather than tasks. One man described a sense of pressure near a particular field, though nothing had happened to him there. The physician wrote, "Anticipation without event produces compliance." He did not attach a case name. A letter surfaced briefly in a family archive, unsigned, undated, describing the afternoon in 1893 as a lesson that required no blood. The letter offered no details and was returned to storage. When rediscovered years later, it was missing. References to older Ozark practices continued to appear in academic margins. Scholars noted how communities once maintained order with singular demonstrations that avoided escalation. The bald knobbers were cited again as historical context, evidence that restraint once displayed could outlast punishment. The comparison remained analytical, never accusatory. The pasture itself recovered partially. Native grasses returned in patches, yet the rectangular outline persisted, faint but legible after rain. Livestock stepped around it instinctively. People did the same. No one sought to memorialize the place. No marker was erected. Memory did not need reinforcement. By winter, the incident had achieved its final form. Not story, not warning, but calibration. It taught by absence. It governed without voice. The hills recognized the economy of it. And so, in the Ozarks, where authority often traveled faster than law, the enclosure's shadow continued to shape movement long after its boards were gone, proving that what had been demonstrated once did not require repetition to remain effective. By 1910, the incident had aged into a reference point used without explanation. County meetings recorded fewer formal complaints from the surrounding townships. Mediation requests dropped. The change was noted, then attributed to improved relations. No one connected it publicly to the empty pasture, though the overlap was understood. A brief effort to modernize land use brought surveyors back to the area. Their instruments confirmed what farmers already knew. The soil within the former enclosure remained compacted far beyond what weather alone would explain. One surveyor suggested mechanical compression from repeated pressure. Another wrote simply, "Ground remembers weight." The phrase did not make it into the final report. A traveling judge heard a minor dispute involving boundary lines near the pasture. When the parties realized the hearing would require testimony taken on site, both withdrew their claims and settled privately. The judge remarked that he had never seen a case dissolve so quickly. He did not ask why. In private letters, a professor studying rural governance wrote that certain Ozark communities had learned to conclude matters without spectacle. He cited a late 19th century incident involving livestock and labor but did not name it. He observed that such events often outlived statutes because they altered expectation rather than behavior alone. The land changed owners again. The new family planted orchards farther upslope, leaving the lower ground untouched. When asked about the decision, the farmer replied that the soil there didn't want improving. It was said without humor. No one attempted to revive the enclosure. No one proposed commemorating it. The absence had matured into a boundary that required no fence. Jonah Reed's story remained untold. Without his voice, the incident stayed unbalanced, half record, half behavior. That imbalance proved durable. Stories require retelling to survive. Habits do not. As the decade progressed, younger men learned caution as a matter of course. They did not know the names involved. They did not know the year. They only knew that certain demonstrations had already been made and did not need repeating. The Ozarks had always favored such efficiencies. And so the place where 5 fighting bulls once stood with a single man became ordinary again: grass, slope, silence, yet never neutral. It carried a completed decision, one that had concluded itself so thoroughly that nothing further was asked of it. By 1912, the incident had crossed into a generation that knew it only as a fact. Young men entering work did not ask why certain fields were avoided or why disputes settled so quickly in that part of the county. They learned the rules the same way they learned weather, by watching what others did and copying it. A county extension agent conducting interviews that year noted the absence of formal grievances among laborers in the area. He attributed this to efficient management practices, a phrase that appeared repeatedly in his report. In a private margin note, he added, "Efficiency here precedes instruction." The note mirrored earlier observations almost word for word, though the agent had no access to the old file. A quiet attempt was made to level the former enclosure ground using new equipment. The work stalled after repeated mechanical failures, chains slipping, blades digging unevenly. The foreman abandoned the effort after 2 days, citing cost. He told a neighbor the ground didn't take correction. No one challenged him. References to the region's older history surfaced again in scholarly circles. A lecture on post-Reconstruction Authority structures mentioned how communities sometimes relied on singular demonstration to enforce compliance without sustained violence. The lecturer referenced the bald knobbers as historical context, an example of how restraint, once displayed, could govern behavior long after the actors disappeared. The Ozark case was not named, but the audience recognized the outline. That winter, An elderly man who had witnessed the incident as a youth gave a final account to his grandson. He described the afternoon not as violent, but as decisive. "It wasn't about hurting him," the man said. "It was about showing what could be done without doing it." The grandson later wrote the words down, unsure why they mattered. No new incidents echoed the pen. No imitation occurred. The effectiveness of the act lay precisely in its singularity. Repetition would have cheapened it. By the following spring, the land had changed little. Rain softened the edges of the old outline but did not erase it. Footpaths still curved subtly away. Rest stops were chosen elsewhere. The adjustment had become automatic. And so the incident persisted not as memory, but as calibration, a shared understanding that certain boundaries existed even when nothing marked them visibly. The Ozarks had absorbed the lesson fully. All that remained was one final transition, when memory itself would give way entirely to habit. The last trace of the incident appears where no one thought to look for it. In 1917, a county maintenance ledger recorded routine work, fence repairs, drainage checks, minor grading after heavy rain. One entry, written in a careful hand, noted a small adjustment to a footpath near the lower pasture. The reason given was brief: route altered, ground not suitable. No further explanation followed. By then, nearly 25 years had passed since the afternoon Elia's harrow closed a gate behind a man and left 5 fighting bulls to answer a question no one had asked aloud. Harrow was long dead. Jonah Reed had never returned. The pen itself no longer existed in any functional sense. And yet the ground still shaped movement. Those who worked the land spoke of it less and less, not because it had been forgotten, but because it no longer required language. The incident had completed its work. It had altered expectation, not through injury or trial, but through a single demonstration that stopped short of blood. That restraint, more than anything else, allowed it to endure. A retired clerk, asked once why the file was never formally closed, replied that there was nothing left to resolve. "It reached its outcome early," he said. "Everything after was just adjustment." The answer satisfied the questioner. It always did. In a lecture delivered shortly before the war, a regional historian reflected on how authority had been exercised in the Ozarks after Reconstruction. He spoke of vigilance without spectacle, of communities that preferred implication to enforcement. He referenced the old history of the bald knobbers as context, not to accuse, but to illustrate a pattern the hills had known before. "These places remember methods," he said. "They don't require repetition." The audience understood the implication. No marker was ever placed where the pen had stood. No caution sign. No story for visitors. The land was allowed to return to use around it, not through it. Paths curved. Crops grew elsewhere. The absence remained intact. Those who passed near the place sometimes remarked on the quiet, not an eerie quiet, but a settled one. Nothing asked to happen there again. Nothing needed to. And that is how the case concluded, without judgment or confession. Not solved, not denied, simply absorbed. In the Ozarks, where power has often traveled faster than law and memory longer than record, the incident became what it always was meant to be. A boundary that did not need guarding, a lesson that did not need repeating. The ground held. The people adjusted. And the hills, patient as ever, kept the rest, without comment, without correction, and without offering anything back.